Well, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this launch of the report titled Net Zero Plus, Climate and Economic Resilience in a Changing World. It's really great to see so many of you here today for what I think will be a really insightful event. So let's get immediately into it, and it's my very great pleasure to be able to invite our Secretary-General, Mathias Cormann, to the stage to provide some opening remarks. So, Mathias, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends all. A very warm welcome to this launch of the flagship OECD report, Net Zero Plus, Climate and Economic Resilience in a Changing World. The Net Zero Plus project is a whole of OECD project for us, which reflects the fact that climate change is a core economic and development issue, affecting virtually every area of policy making. It draws on findings from the full breadth of the OECD's multidisciplinary expertise, including economic and tax policy, financial and fiscal affairs, development, science and technology, employment and social affairs, and of course, environment and climate policy, among others. It provides recommendations for accelerating action, and it leverages unique OECD data sets to support better policy making. New data developed for this project shows that the proportion of our populations and economic assets being exposed to extreme weather events continues to increase. In 2021, 17% more people in countries that are members of the OECD's International Programme for Action on Climate were exposed to hot summer days compared to 1979. This will have a global impact on the security of our food systems, on migration, on development and growth, and ultimately on peace and stability in the world. The impact will be particularly devastating for low-income countries, in particular those that depend economically as a major proportion of their GDP on agriculture, forestry, or fishing. In some regions, including southern Brazil, Paraguay, and northeast Argentina, extreme water stress and heat waves have substantially reduced yields of key crops like maize and soybean in 2022. We need to address these risks through climate change mitigation and adaptation, and we need to take an approach that tackles them simultaneously, not separately. Doing so will help make our economies and societies generally more resilient, for example, by reducing climate-related damages and their economic costs. The OECD is contributing to these efforts through our whole-of-government approach to climate policy. The Net Zero Plus project sits alongside three other flagship OECD initiatives on climate action. First, the OECD's Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which is designed to help optimize the global impact of individual countries' efforts to reduce emissions. Net Zero Plus complements the Inclusive Forum's focus on mitigation policies with insights on adaptation and resilience. Second, the International Programme for Action on Climate, IPAC, which establishes headline indicators to track and monitor both the impacts of climate change and our climate adaptation and mitigation responses across OECD and non-OECD countries. And third, the OECD, of course, does important work to track progress towards delivering on the commitment by developed economies to provide and mobilize $100 billion US annually in climate finance for developing countries under the UNFCCC framework and the Paris Agreement. Net Zero Plus adds to this tracking with recommendations on aligning finance and investment with resilience, including adaptation measures and climate risk assessments. So the report we are launching today brings together findings from the first phase of the Net Zero Plus project. And 3 priority areas for action stand out. First, we need to ensure that our measures to cushion the impact of short-term pressures do not divert us from achieving our longer-term mission to tackle climate change in a way that is globally effective. Despite recent progress, climate change is not yet sufficiently mainstreamed across policy areas. Our analysis shows that only 1/3 of all COVID recovery spending went to environmentally sustainable projects. And recent price support and government subsidies in response to the energy crisis have not been sufficiently well targeted, risking to delay the increasingly urgent green energy transition. More than half of the global support provided as of last summer went to fossil fuels, mostly in the form of non-targeted price support. Going forward, climate strategies will need to be resilient to future shocks, while also ensuring long-term efficiency to better absorb future disruptions and to limit the need for emergency intervention. Our report outlines how strategic foresight techniques, scanning the horizon for new developments and emerging trends, constructing scenarios about how the future could unfold, and designing forward-looking strategies under a wide range of possible circumstances can enhance the ability of countries and organizations to meet their net zero greenhouse gas emissions ambitions. Second, ensuring that climate policies are fiscally as well as environmentally sustainable. New OECD modeling carried out for this project shows that the choice of climate policy mix matters greatly when it comes to the fiscal sustainability of carbon mitigation approaches. Carbon pricing generates revenue. Subsidies cost money. And overall, the effect on public finances of different policy mixes and in different regions is projected to vary by almost 3% of GDP, which is a substantial cost. Overall, the effect on public overall, of course, that is a very substantial cost that needs to be factored into decision-making moving forward. Governments can address the public finance implications of the transition through careful fiscal planning, assessing direct and indirect effects of policies, and transitioning to net zero-aligned tax instruments, for example, moving from fuel taxes to distance-based charges. Third, integrating climate change mitigation and adaptation policies with efforts focused on biodiversity and climate resilience efforts. The climate system is intrinsically linked with biodiversity and natural capital. Nature-based solutions, which involve using ecosystems to provide natural protection against environmental risks, are one example. For example, efforts to restore forests or mangroves create an opportunity to increase ecosystems' carbon storage capacity, while also contributing to the reduction of weather-related risks, such as landslides or coastal storm surges. But implementation remains minimal due to a lack of awareness regarding their effectiveness, challenges in quantifying costs and benefits, and their omission from legal frameworks. There is, we believe, great potential to take better advantage of such synergies, and Net Zero Plus provides solutions to identify, implement, and monitor them effectively. In closing, the varied set of approaches countries use or plan to use is important and fully justified given the unique and diverse range of circumstances, industrial mix and even geography different parts of the world are operating within. But the challenge is to ensure that all of these individual efforts are globally as effective as they can be. We can benefit significantly from the exchange of experiences and data to translate ambition and efforts into real outcomes and to better manage some of the cross-border impacts and implications through inclusive multilateral dialogue. Our work at the OECD, including through Net Zero Plus, is designed to help achieve and do just that. Thank you for the opportunity to say a few words up front. I very much look forward to a great discussion, and I hope that you will find the findings in this report useful. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Matthias. Those were really clear, insightful, if somewhat sobering remarks. And as you mentioned, this project is a key implementing arm for the OECD's whole-of-organisation approach to climate policy. I absolutely agree the stakes just couldn't be higher. And I'm very happy to have an opportunity today to dive a little bit deeper into some of the Net Zero Plus report's key findings. The report contains an enormous amount of information and many insights that have been drawn from right across the OECD. But we have tried to distill that down into summarised policy guidance that includes 12 key steps for governments in building climate and economic resilience. And I'm going to take you through those 12 steps today. But first, what do we mean by Net Zero Plus? Climate policy making today is about much more than simply meeting the net zero target. What the report shows is that how we get there is just as important. I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit later because the shape and the speed of the trajectory really matters. But the net zero transition must also be resilient to changing circumstances and unexpected global disruptions. And of course, climate policy strategies will only work in the long term if they're both useful and publicly supported. And I think that's really important, that social licence. And for this, they need to be fair and equitable. At the same time, we are facing enormous economic changes. So strategies also need to safeguard fiscal and financial resilience. And finally, frankly, even if we stopped all greenhouse gas emissions today, we know that we're still going to be facing and are already experiencing unavoidable climate impacts. So a systemic approach to adaptation is also essential. So that, in a nutshell, is what we mean by plus. Basically, that the climate challenge is truly multifaceted and needs a whole-of-government approach. Net Zero Plus supports such an approach, leveraging the OECD's unique multidisciplinary expertise. It also reflects how climate change has begun to be mainstreamed across the different parts of the organisation. It draws on contributions from across 17 different OECD policy committees. The project directly involved teams from 16 different OECD directorates and partner organisations, as well as external collaborators like YouthWise, the OECD's Youth Advisory Board. So with all of that, it is a living demonstration of the whole of OECD effort to address climate change. So I'm now going to take you briefly through the 12 key steps we recommend governments take in order to build climate and economic resilience in today's world, and in order to progress transformative and effective action on climate. Now, I should stress this is not an A to Z guide of climate policy. It focuses in particular on the need to embed resilience and systems thinking into our approaches to both mitigating and adapting to climate change. So first and foremost, Governments need to do everything possible to limit a global temperature overshoot beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius. This means reducing emissions now and quickly, as it's not just the end point, but also the shape of the pathway that matters. And why is that? It's because the most up-to-date evidence on climate system tipping points shows that, as this graph shows, we're already entering the warming range on the left-hand side, at which these potentially catastrophic and irreversible impacts become possible. This is particularly alarming for us all, and it really hammers home the point that every fraction of a degree of warming matters. As Mathias pointed out in his opening remarks, the large amounts spent on crisis relief and economic recovery over the past few years were a real opportunity as well to accelerate climate action, if you could describe it as the silver lining to an otherwise very dark cloud. Well, some progress was made, but regrettably, we could have done much more. So we must do better to seize the climate opportunities that may come with future disruptions. As we now all know too well, the world doesn't move forward in a predictable, linear fashion. Future-proofing climate strategies means anticipating future disruptions and bottlenecks. For example, by integrating the practice of strategic foresight into policy-making processes. And for this project, we carried out what was an eye-opening foresight process, looking at the potential disruptions to net zero and how they can be anticipated. But the scale and pervasive nature of climate change means that we can't just focus on individual outcomes or components. Resilient climate policy making calls for a systemic level or a systems level, approach, both for our net zero policies and to become resilient to the impacts of climate change, to adapt to climate change. Systemic resilience means we need to anticipate future shocks, build in buffers to absorb initial impacts, and ensure the availability of resources to invest in recovery efforts. It also means acknowledging that some changes may be irreversible and require permanent adaptation to new circumstances. Now, accompanying the need to think on a systems level is a need to finally get serious about mainstreaming adaptation into our core policy thinking. It's ever more clear that governments are faced with escalating costs due to climate damages. The figure on the slide shows the change in the number of unusually warm days already being experienced, and Mathias referred to this too. It confirms, without a doubt, that the world is already warming and will continue to do so despite our best efforts. I want to turn now specifically to the net zero transition. And before getting into how we can make transition policies resilient, let's be clear that we must also be getting the policy basics right. Governments have a wide range of climate policy tools at their disposal, and they need to tailor these to their specific needs and circumstances, including the right mix of price-based and non-price-based policies. And that's certainly what's sitting behind the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches Mathias referred to. A resilient transition needs to be fiscally sustainable, as Mathias said. The scale of the economic transformation needed is going to considerably alter government revenue streams. For example, taxes on petrol are a key public revenue stream. If we're serious about decarbonisation and make good headway in achieving it, those revenues are going to diminish, if not be lost entirely. Our modelling of the public finance implications of the net zero transition shows incredibly heterogeneous effects across both countries and across time, as seen in this figure. Careful fiscal planning is essential, considering not only the direct but also the indirect effects of policy mixes on public finance resilience. The modelling also shows that at current levels of technological development, reaching net zero is going to be more costly than it needs to be. To change that, we have to innovate, and government support for this is critical. A mission-oriented approach means targeting support to early-stage innovation that's going to drive technological advancement. The scale and speed of the transition is going to impact households. Managing the economic burden of climate policies on people is essential. Revenue from carbon pricing can be recycled to balance distributional impacts, for example. But to ensure that the net zero transition is publicly supported, governments need to clearly communicate not only why policies are needed, but how they will be implemented and what impacts they're going to have on households. The economic shifts implied by the net zero transition are also going to affect workers in some sectors, with new jobs created and as some others are lost. Governments need to find the right balance between having a flexible labour market and supporting workers affected in this transition, protecting them financially while helping them find new jobs and learn new skills. Of course, we know government spending alone can't meet investment needs. Financial markets and the private sector have a really critical role to play. Governments can help by creating an enabling environment to align finance and investment flows, as well as business decision-making, and align all of that with adaptation and mitigation goals. And finally, policy action on climate calls for all of us, all regions, all countries, all cities, to be on board. Here, the OECD has an important contribution to make, given our particular role at the hub of the development assistance community, with great potential to improve trust internationally. Developing and emerging economies, both the source of the majority of future emissions and also those the most exposed to the future impacts of climate change, these economies will require international support to meet their development needs, while at the same time decarbonising their economies and building resilience to climate impacts. The report itself, of course, provides a much more detailed package of recommendations that dive into each of the topics I've just touched on today. These 12 steps, if implemented effectively, provide a means for governments to navigate effective, resilient and fair climate policy making that responds to our changing and increasingly complex world, with policies that are going to be well aligned across all parts of government. Well, happily, this project does not end here. We have been given a unanimous mandate from our member countries to continue the work into a second phase. Now, the new phase continues to build on the risks and resilience theme of the first phase, but it also adds a new pillar, focusing on enabling transitions to net zero. Both pillars will be supported by continued cross-cutting work on tracking progress through the International Programme for Action on Climate, IPAC. In the new pillar, the key question we're asking is, what can we do now to accelerate and achieve a step change in climate action in the short term, including by looking at the notion of positive tipping points. Having identified the severe risks, we're right on the cusp of triggering in that first phase of the Net Zero Plus project. It's going to be exciting to explore what we can do to tip the seesaw definitively in the other direction. So I'm going to stop with this now because I really want us to move on to the panel discussion. To do that, I'd like to invite our panellists onto the stage, introduce them, and then we will have a discussion followed by Q&A with the audience. Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. Have we got this working? Do I need to do something? It's working. Excellent. It's hard to tell from here. Thank you, panellists, for coming to the stage. I should say right up front that Natacha Alexander, one of our panellists, has been told she has to go to something much more important. No, it is very important because she represents the UK, and the UK is hosting the Ministerial Council meeting this year, so it's getting down to the wire, crunch time. So I'm going to probably give you a chance to take the floor earlier on. But just to quickly introduce everybody, as I said, Natacha Alexander, Ambassador of the United Kingdom to the OECD, and she's been Ambassador here since June 2021. She's held a range of posts in the UK Treasury, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and the United Nations. And we've been delighted that the UK has been a keen supporter of Net Zero Plus throughout the project, and in particular, as I said, with the upcoming chairing role of this year's Ministerial Council meeting, at which this report will be a deliverable. Also want to introduce Sébastien Treyer, who is the Executive Director of IDDRI. Sébastien has been the Executive Director for this Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relationships here in Paris since 2019, overseeing their valuable work on climate, biodiversity, ecosystems, oceans, and sustainable development governance. So governance, of course, a lot of that resonates with the Net Zero Plus report. Next, I would like to introduce Dominic Waughray, who's the Executive Vice President of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He's been based in Geneva and doing this role since the beginning of the year, but longer than that with the Business Council. And he leads the strategic work on climate, nature, and tackling inequality, working closely with the private sector actors to develop solutions that mainstream climate action, improve corporate accountability, and scale nature-positive business action, while keeping considerations of equity at the fore. And again, we've really appreciated Dominic's contribution to Net Zero Plus through his involvement as in our high-level external advisory panel. Finally, Andy Kerr, who works at a Climate-KIC, where he has been the Chief Strategy Officer since last year, but longer working with Climate-KIC. He's got vast experience in leadership roles in organisations that help cities, regions, countries and investors to meet ambitious targets around the net zero and resilience themes. The work Climate-KIC does on change across a system fits really well with the Net Zero Plus report. And I'm sure Andy's going to have lots of fascinating insights about how engagement with diverse stakeholders is an important facet of getting to net zero. So let's kick things off. Now, Natacha, I'm going to give you the floor, basically let you say what you would like to say, because the first part of this, we really wanted to focus on the need for a systemic approach to building climate economic resilience, but also any thoughts you have about how the OECD can be of most value to its members through its cross-cutting and multidisciplinary reach. Any comments you want to make before you go about the upcoming MCM and the relevance of this report to that would be really valuable for us as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And this is clearly the kind of panel you have to accept the invitation to if you're told that you can say whatever you'd like to say. So thank you very much for that wonderful opportunity. And look, I'm delighted to be able to be here today and to support the launch of this Net Zero Plus report, which is absolutely critical. And your introductory words, as well as the introductory words from the Secretary-General, have made this really clear. It is really timely. And it comes at a time when a need for a whole of government and a whole of organisation, and dare I say it, a whole of economy approach is absolutely fundamental. So firstly, let me take this opportunity to thank you all here at the OECD for the work that you have done in putting this report together. And I was really struck to hear how many directorates and the number of contributions that you have had to deliver this piece of analytical and policy advice report. Now, what we are trying to do here collectively is build ambition and a more coherent approach across the organisation, but across our economies domestically as well. So the OECD has a unique role in providing this support because of the breadth that it covers in terms of macroeconomic analysis, but also the structural issues and data that you have to support what has to be a just and sustainable transition. So you asked me for some thoughts on the kind of areas where we believe the OECD can provide real value added. And let me firstly go back to the basics. It's data and it's evidence. And the OECD, we believe, and we value, provides support to governments through the wealth of its international climate-related data indicators, which provide a remarkable coverage across a range of sectors, and which adds real value to domestic countries in terms of their shift, in terms of their economy to tackle climate objectives. Now, the evidence-then-based research that enables these governments to draw the synergies and make sure that we achieve these climate objectives is fundamental and a key part of our transition to net zero. In the UK, we have really valued the work that you have done on climate and adaptation in particular, and the measurement of progress in adaptation, which has not been done before. And we were one of the first countries to complete a case study looking at our process and methods for monitoring adaptive action. And when the evidence is evolving and the science keeps evolving, you touched on positive tipping points, which is a fairly recent concept, but where the evidence is evolving, the measurement and the learning from others is particularly crucial to inform policy making and decision making. The second aspect that we particularly value is the expert policy analysis that you provide so well. And this sort of in terms of shaping not only our domestic response, but how collectively we can deliver on our international climate goals. And obviously, the Net Zero Plus report comes after the IPCC's urgent warning of the consequences of climate change and what awaits us if we fail to deliver on the 1.5 degree. Now, what your report does through the data and the evidence and the policy advice is to identify the actions that we as governments, but also private sector, can take. But you also recognise what is feasible and effective as options to tackle, which are available to us now. And I think that is a really important positive message, that the action is not in the future, the action is now. Let me also talk really briefly about the convening power and the global reach of the OECD, which is about pulling together these different threads, the multidisciplinary competence, the data, the evidence-based research, and the platform for sharing this learning and the analysis, as well as facilitating international discussions which go beyond the membership of the organisation. And I just wanted to sort of touch on, the Secretary-General has in his introductory remarks touched on the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, which represents all of those different elements that I've just mentioned, and which we are highly supportive of and see huge value in. Now, you also asked me about the MCM, the Ministerial Council meeting, which the UK is absolutely delighted to be chairing alongside our vice chairs, Costa Rica and New Zealand. The overarching theme is very much about economic resilience. It's about securing a resilient future, shared values, and global partnerships. And this theme is very much a recognition that today we face economic, political, social, environmental challenges that transcend borders. These are not issues that we can tackle as individual countries, but they require global solutions. And we believe the OECD has a key role to play in helping us tackle these challenges. But the OECD is also doing extensive work on the digital transition as well as the climate transition, which are key challenges that our economies face today. And what we are aiming to do is to look at how we can draw out the synergies between these two projects and how one transition can support the delivery of the other. Now, as MCM chairs, we would like to we have an ambition to discuss how to harness technological change, to build inclusive, sustainable economies, and to deliver on net zero, but keeping the 1.5 degree in reach. That is absolutely critical to us in terms of the broader context for the reasons that you very powerfully outlined in your introductory words. Now, ministers will also have the opportunity to discuss areas for international collaboration in respect to new and emerging technologies, and to address also the intellect challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss, which is another key component that we are looking at. But we would like also to do this in a way that is addressing how best to be inclusive and how to harness the talent of our societies, and not in a way that would increase inequalities and divides within our societies and between countries. I think I might stop there, Joe. I'm conscious I've spoken quite a bit, but let me leave it at that. But thank you all very much for this outstanding report.
Oh, thanks very much, Natacha, and that's a great teaser for the MCM. I think it's promising a lot and touching on an enormous number of really timely and critical issues, and how we kind of pull all of that together will be really, I think, hopefully an extremely stimulating and useful exercise for everyone. Conscious that you're going in a couple of minutes, I just wanted to ask a quick follow-up question, because I know the UK has been a pioneer in strategic foresight, and particularly in relation to climate change. This was a key part of the Net Zero Plus first phase. So if there's any insights you can share from a UK perspective on how you found that strategic foresight focus, that would be really great. And after that, I'm going to happily not hold you up any longer, but release you.
No problem, Joe. Thank you. Just really briefly, look, we are taking an approach that looks to be as innovative as we can, and we are definitely looking at ways that we can increase our access to data, that we can increase our understanding of the science and how we can get the science and the economics to work together in the most effective way and in a timely way. So in that sense, you know, if strategic foresight can provide us with that tool, that framework, etc., that is something that the UK is looking at to make the best policy decisions that we can to deliver both on our near-term commitments as well as our long-term commitments to deliver on the biggest economic shift that I think most of our countries and societies will have to make.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for coming along today. So whenever you feel you need to make a move, please do appreciate the inputs you've given, and making yourself available to be part of the panel. I will turn now to Sébastien. One of the things touched on in the opening remarks was about how the energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine could help to be an opportunity to really kind of accelerate decarbonisation, provide an incentive for governments to reduce their reliance, particularly in terms of imports of fossil fuels. The question is that happening? And if not, what should governments be doing to make it happen, or indeed make it happen more and faster?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm really glad to be here for this report that I really congratulate you for. I think we can say that in the European Union we have seen to some extent as an example, and not just that this would be representative of everything that's happening in the world, an example that energy security as a concern is pushing governments in the direction of this type of systemic resilience that you are advocating with the report. Particularly because one of the key elements that has been on the table is the issue of demand-side management, trying to reduce demand beyond just issues of energy efficiency. We have that in France with the debate on sobriété. I would say sufficiency in English rather than sobriety. But that's I think something that is quite new, and that is to me one of the key elements at the basis of this issue of the systemic approach that the report is advocating for. I believe it's all the more important because we also see that the crisis in Ukraine has also triggered, as COVID, a whole reflection on the vulnerability of global supply chains. And I believe what's more important than just the motto about reshoring or friendshoring, that is sometimes concerning to me because I'm not sure how realistic that might be and how good that might be actually to always try to reshore in terms of collective and individual prosperity in all regions of the world. I believe this has triggered, nevertheless, a conversation that is systemic, which means if we believe that we need to be more efficient in the use of fossil fuel, then we might rely, there might be other supply chains that are there that need to be dealt with, and hence the discussion on critical raw materials that has also happened in the European Union. And if you go beyond that, I mean, that was a statement already by Secretary-General Cormann and by yourself, Ms. Tyndall, about the fact that we need to look at climate and biodiversity. Then suddenly all this becomes, you can't just deal with one planetary boundary, you need to look at all planetary boundaries. This word, this concept, I think, is not mentioned in the report in particular, but net zero is really about the transformation to stay within the planetary boundary of not impairing the carbon cycle further. And you can't do that without looking at the nitrogen cycle, at biodiversity, etc., etc. And then I think that's the entry point for a debate that I think is already happening in many instances about how what we need to look at is through the lens of securing access to specific functions like energy, food, etc. So the security lens is leading necessarily to having a more systemic approach about food systems transformation, mobility systems transformation, and energy systems transformation, including this key concept and key element of the discussion that is about sufficiency. But this is not easy. We see with the Green Deal, for instance, that the food security debate is back 15 years, is back to the way it was after the food crisis of 2007, and very often with very bad arguments that have been contradicted for the last 15 years on why we don't need to produce a lot here for global food security, for instance. So there are ways in which security of supply is used with a very non-objectively supported way to change the political debate in the wrong way. So not everything is positive, but I believe there was a wake-up call with the energy security crisis that I think has still a lot of impact in the right way.
Okay, so we're starting along the pathway, but there is a long way to go. I mean, you can start to see the whole thing getting wider and wider. You know, if you move beyond critical materials to be thinking about circular economy and so on, and alternatives to, as you say, to reshoring. And also questions about whether, you know, if you are encouraging energy efficiency, are you reducing usage, genuinely reducing usage, or if there have been subsidies, does that just mean that people are, you know, still using the same amount of energy and not making the savings that have to happen? Okay, so it's a really good and huge debate to be getting into, so you can understand why 16 different directorates within the organisation started to have a look. Dominic, wanted to turn now to the private sector perspective. And ask you whether you think that the recent policies that have been implemented in response to inflation and cost of living, so this really follows on from Sébastien's point, have those policies helped or hindered the business sector's climate plans and investment towards their net zero commitments, and what could be done better?
Thanks so
Big
much.
question.
Thanks so much, Joe. And if I can just add my congratulations to an excellent piece of work. And I can't imagine how many meetings there were to have 16 different directorates all engaging. I'm sure it was all seamless and smooth, totally. And that is it in a microcosm, right? That's a systems change bit. If you can do it in OECD, then I'm sure we can kind of apply that to the broader system that is out there. So many congratulations. So look, 6 months ago, maybe you had seen it a bit earlier than 6 months ago, 9 months ago, but the acronym IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, wasn't really knocking around. 6 months later, $90 billion has been spent. $90 billion has been spent on incentive-based policy. That's had a huge implication in Georgia, in Tennessee, in Michigan, billions of dollars of investment into battery development, into chip, into EV, and definitely has had an impact. Whether you like it or not, from whichever part of the policy spectrum you're on, it has had an impact. You could argue that's a system change. You could argue that enabling policy, which is a fairly anodyne statement sometimes, well, that's what it looks like, you know, plus, plus, plus. And you could argue that it is speeding up the transition to the green future that we want. You could argue that it's creating an enormous amount of pressure on global value chains and asking a lot of where our rare earth minerals come from. You could argue that it's creating consternation in other jurisdictions who perhaps haven't thought about taking that approach. But that really is the transition in action. It won't be smooth. It will be jagged. It won't be the same everywhere. And it will be, if you like, a kind of a race to the top in terms of who has competitive advantage, if this is the new industrial paradigm. So all of those things which have fairly anodyne statements sometimes in the policy document, this is what it looks like. It's starting to happen. Here we are. What has been most interesting from a business perspective is the introduction of incentive-based policy. And let me just give you a quick example. Are many of you in the environment policy space or from different areas? How many do environment, sort of climate policy? Okay, brilliant. So this is to you, but to others as well. So you know, because you've been working in this for some time, that basically climate policy for business has been emit less. Let us set a target to reduce emissions, scope 1, scope 2, the tricky one, scope 3, but do less emitting. Set a target, have a plan, account for it annually and disclose it, but kind of do less, please, because that's a pollution externality. And that's basically been the approach. It is vital and it is absolutely what we need to do, but is it sufficient? So it's vital and it's absolutely what we need to do, and more companies are getting their arms around doing that, but is it sufficient? If we just have companies that might be making, for example, diesel-generated air conditioning units, but they've got that inventory of emissions under control, but they're still making diesel-powered air conditioning units. Have we won this battle? No. Because what has not happened has been an incentive to shift the core business model of that business into, for example, making photovoltaic, PV-powered air conditioning units, or other goods and services that society needs that have a zero-emission, low-carbon future. So the introduction of incentive-based policy, and we're using the example of the Inflation Reduction Act, there could be other things underway, for example, in Japan under its G7 presidency, has changed that dynamic. We're very used to, in Europe, having that do less bad regulatory policy, curb your inventory of emissions, please. We're less used to, okay, so let me subsidize you for doing more good. And that has been a very, very interesting development in the corporate climate agenda. One example of that has been the emergence of a intervention accounting system, so-called avoided emissions. Why should I do more good if there is no accounting mechanism that recognizes me for putting all of that R&D and that CapEx and all of that human effort into shifting my business model from the 20th century to the 21st century to make all that PV stuff, or to have digital goods and services that create zero emissions, or whatever it might be? How do I attract lower costs of capital from investors if I'm doing that? Where do they go to see that I'm doing that? There is nothing in the accounting mechanism, my intangibles, or in other ways, to show that I'm shifting into doing more good. All I'm being measured on is doing less bad. The arrival of an avoided emissions framework, which was encouraged by the Japanese government, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and was cited in the G7 communique, so supported and welcomed by the other G7 members, creates that intervention-based accounting that over the next period of time, let's say 20 years, if you are, on the one hand, doing all that you can as a company to minimize your emissions inventory, you can be eligible to show how you are putting goods and services into society that are doing much more good. That is a very, very big step in the corporate carbon accountability regime, which is mirroring and will be supportive of and will accelerate, I suspect, the incentive-based policy that the Inflation Reduction Act promotes. For example, if I'm looking as the architect of the Inflation Reduction Act, how do I know which companies are the right ones to put my subsidy toward? This inventory accounting will tell you. If I'm a financial institution and I'm committed under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to find companies to put my money into which are promoting the net zero transition, what accounting mechanisms do I look for that will help me get there? This will help you do it. So the stimulation of incentive-based policy has sped up also the way that we can account for and identify companies who are moving in this direction and accelerate it. So that's one very clear indicator of what has happened, I would suggest, within the last year or so. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. That's yeah, that's an interesting take on it, Dominic. And I think that one of the things that's become very evident through the IFCMA, the Inclusive Forum on Carbon Mitigation Approaches, is that that it's a policy mix that most governments are looking at. Whether they have a price-based policy as their foundational tool, they are looking at other approaches, incentive or regulation-based on a sector-by-sector approach. But one quick follow-up question, though, is that in taking an incentive-based approach, there can be risks to government in picking policy winners, or sorry, technology winners rather than policy winners. So how do you avoid that?
That's a super question. So on the one hand, and you're absolutely right, the policy mix, so we don't lose the inventory-based accounting. One has to deliver reductions in line with, as you were saying, in one of those policy boxes of getting to 2050 net zero. You have to do that. On top of that, if you can have also incentive-based policy, which can help investors and other policymakers identify who is shifting fastest to reward, that's good. But the framework for doing that doesn't pick a technology. That's the beauty of it. It just creates the accounting mechanisms. You can see who's moving. So that's the way out of that one.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of explaining that and emphasising it. Thanks for the clarification. Andy, thank you for waiting. The question I wanted to ask you is that, as I said in my introduction to you, systems thinking is pretty central to Climate-KIC's work. And I'm really interested to hear from you in light of these recent crises, potential for future disruptions, which we're all now seeing as, you know, the kind of perma-crisis or multi-crisis, whatever it is, approach we take. How can governments take a more systems-oriented approach to their climate policies? So we know we need to do it. How?
Thanks, Joe. And I'd just add our congratulations for the report, because it's great to see systems thinking put at the heart of some of these issues. But can I be honest? If we walk into a room in a government with a bunch of policy people or ministers and start talking about systems-orientated approaches, you can see people's eyes glaze over, people furtively looking for the door to exit. We have to make it real. Yeah. So if you talk at that very large scale, it always seems too big, too ephemeral. So we have to anchor it in something. And the work that we anchor it in is very much at the place-based, whether that's a city, a region, a state, or even a country or an industry value chain within that. But you have to start somewhere where it is tangible. The other thing I think about systems is that we are talking about complex systems. And I think it was a point that you made. You know, you've got complex systems where you've got cascading risks, cascading shocks, and Matthias said it at the beginning as well. These are inherently unpredictable. Yeah. So we have to start from that position. And we also know that the speed and the scale of the change is so huge that actually none of us, not the well-paid consultants, not the policy analysts, not the ministers, have all of the answers. So one of the big challenges for governments that we have seen, whether it's a city, a region, a national government, is actually that mindset shift from actually we know what we're doing and this is what we need to do. We need to pull a policy lever here, we need to do an economic instrument there, and magically we'll get to net zero. And instead saying, actually, we know the building blocks, and some of the work that is coming out of the OECD is a really good example of that. But actually, we're going to have to do this through learning by doing. We're going to have to bring together different players, different understanding, and test things in practice at scale. And that's a really challenging approach for governments and for the whole notion of we know where we want to get to, but we've got some real questions about the how, because there isn't a single, this is how you achieve it, in this place with that social context, in here with that cultural, economic context. So we've got to do large-scale learning by doing. In that sense, what we're looking for when we're talking to government is about relationships. It's about how do we share learning, how do we build learning within and between policy teams, between ministries. You know, I've said a couple of times that one of the most useful things we seem to have done with some of the governments we've worked with is simply bringing different ministries together to talk for the first time around a problem. So it's actually a lot of that whole piece for me is really important. I just want to leave you on this particular one just with a reflection on that. It's unpredictable. I was involved in some policy development work in the UK about 20 years ago. And at the time they were setting, they had to use guesstimates of what the future fossil fuel and energy prices were going to be. And at the time, they had a sort of a low fossil oil price guess at $10 a barrel. Yeah. What do you think their high was? Anybody? This was for the next 20 years through until 2020. You know? 40. It was 20. No. Yeah? And they had a high scenario, which was 30. Yeah? Now, you think what's happened the last 20 years. So when we're talking about policy analysis or even foresighting, that's where you have a real challenge in terms of the sorts of shocks that we're going to see in the system over the next 10, 20 years, which is why we do need foresighting. They're very useful. But actually, even more useful is to build in, I think, as the report said, resilience by design. It's actually building in a sense of how do we build that learning in as we go along. So I think I'll I'll stop now.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Andy. And I think that's one of the things that's sometimes hardest for, well, perhaps not just governments to get their head around. And that is, we're not about making predictions or forecasts. It is about imagining scenarios and kind of being prepared for anything that could happen. Quick follow-up question, how did you stop the eyes from glazing over? And how did you help governments to deal with the fact that there wasn't going to be a neat little recipe to follow that would have the right answer spitting out at the end?
Well, I think our experience has been that most governments are acutely aware of the very, very large gap between their aspiration. In other words, they've set a national climate target, or they've set a city has set a net zero target for 2030, and the reality of where they are, which is they are nowhere near delivering it. So as soon as you've got that, they recognise that actually they have to do something different. And so we're coming in and saying we don't pretend to have the answers, but what we can do are bring in potentially the radical partners, the different way of thinking, bringing together the private sector, the public sector, the civic, to actually look at how we can take this forward. So that's essentially how we start. Yeah. So.
Excellent. Scary stuff, but well worth doing. Now, just a quick round. Yes, we've got time for a quick round of our second round of questions. And I do want to leave a bit of time at the end for questions from the audience. So for this part, really want to shift the focus to some of the key themes that were discussed in the report and talk about what building systemic resilience means in practice. And as with Net Zero Plus, we're talking not only about the resilience of the transition itself, but also resilience in terms of adaptation. This time, perhaps I can start with Dominic. So again, from a private sector perspective, what do you think are the key bottlenecks to the transition and what can governments do to anticipate and kind of open things up a little bit?
Okay, so if we build from an enterprise outward, if we take a sort of building block approach, so if we want hundreds of thousands of companies to be engaged in this transition across value chains and not just 4,000 or a few.
We need SMEs in there as well.
Right. So let's just imagine that we're having a kind of company day, and I'm the poor lad next to my CEO or next to my CFO or next to my kind of chief legal, and I'm looking all of you as the heads of department, and you've just told me that I've got 6 months to create the transition plan for the company to get us on the net zero. But I'm thinking, okay, I've got to find and create a science-based target or some sort of equivalent for the company. I've got to develop a transition plan which involves financing, and I'm scared of talking to my CFO. I've got to kind of figure out how to account for that on an annual basis, perhaps using the greenhouse gas protocol. Oh no, how does Scope 3 work? And I've got to disclose it to what? CDP, to GRI. Oh no. And that is the challenge in terms of a roadblock on transition, and times that by millions of companies, make it 100 times more difficult if you're an SME and you don't have the staff. So you have to kind of figure that out, even though it's not your core capacity. And there you have it. So moving to a frictionless system of corporate carbon accountability is probably one of the biggest hurdles. If we overcome it, it's a bit like I was saying over lunch. We don't think twice now about, you might go out the room and think, well, that was a fairly interesting panel, but I've got to book a hotel in Croatia for the holiday I've got coming up. And you probably wouldn't think twice about doing it these days because you probably kind of go on, I don't know, booking.com or something and book it. But imagine trying to do that 10 years ago. You're going to walk out this room, you're going to try and find a telephone box, a telephone manual. I don't speak Croatian. How on earth do I book a hotel in Croatia? It's that kind of transaction cost times 1 million, which is happening right now with corporates as they're trying to figure out how to do their transition plan, how they set a target, how do they account, and how do they disclose. Frictionless carbon accountability would probably be the biggest unlock if you want to mobilize the corporate agenda into this space.
Okay, so at the moment, companies are having to make it up as they go along. We've got no kind
Not making
of...
it up as you go along, but it's like a cottage industry of choice sets. Like,
Right, okay.
you know, whose target do I go with? What reporting mechanism do I go with? What data do they
It's
want?
the spaghetti bowl we've got at the moment that really needs some order and to be made out of the chaos. Okay, thank you. Sébastien, we know that climate action affects everyone and therefore requires a global response. It's not, you know, the air doesn't care where the greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And that has to be built on trust and cooperation. So how do you think the OECD, particularly with its role in relation to the development assistance community, can support efforts to better integrate climate change into the development process?
Thank you very much, and I think that's a very important, as I was mentioning before and at every other panelist, this report by the OECD is very important also because of the global reach of the OECD. And I think that's extremely important. And the global reach might be, as you say, I will answer your question on the development policy committee of the OECD, but actually it goes also beyond ODA, and that's will be to some extent my main point. So what I believe is extremely important is that the transition we need to look at, not just because of climate, but also because of economic shocks, as you also said, is a transformation of business models in many sectors, and so it goes with the possible trend towards, as I mentioned before, reshoring or the changes in the global geographic configuration of supply chains to ensure maybe more diversity of supply rather than concentration of supply, but also friendshoring or reshoring. These are all mottos, as I said. Some is already happening, and that's a very strong reconfiguration of all the industrial apparatus globally that could happen in the coming years. And for many developing countries, this is really scary because particularly when they see the IRA, they see competition for state aid between China and the US and soon the EU that might leave countries that do not have the same power of subsidy for state aid in a very bad position in terms of attracting investments. So as you see, I'm not so much talking about the ODA policy itself, but the fact that for various reasons, a world where only the major economic powers would be in a capacity to attract industrial investments would not be a sustainable world. We need to ensure that there are industrial jobs and industrial added value capture and industrial innovation in African countries, in Latin American countries, in South Asia countries. But that's a very complicated game to be played. If I look at Europe, I mean, we want green steel with ArcelorMittal in Eastern France. We want also that the Southern African steel industry is transitioning to green. How can we try and make that the share of added value of industrial jobs between Southern Africa and Europe when we import iron ore, or rather import the first stage of transformation, of processing of the iron into steel in Southern Africa, and then we only import that this material that already has added value in Southern Africa, that then we import that to Europe. That's a very complicated negotiation to be had. For the moment, there is no incentive for ArcelorMittal to do that. The public pressure in France in Europe for the part of ArcelorMittal that is in Europe is to have the industrial jobs here because that's the public opinion. And so that is a very complicated conversation. We will not be able to have it if there is no incentive by the OECD to get into that conversation, because the OECD is a place where we can discuss among the OECD members what would be our interests to go for something that is not a zero-sum game in this discussion of the new supply chains of the future. And then it could be, of course, it must be expanded to the other countries, but I think the OECD would be a very important forum to have that. If you allow me just one last element that I think is very important in the whole conversation that we have. I said it, I think you said it also, for many of the sectors that we are looking at, and I'm thinking, for instance, of the food sector in France, The problem is not the transition for climate, it's just that the economic viability is at stake. So economic resilience is actually first and foremost. And so we should not only look at the cost of the transition to net zero or the cost of the transition to be adapted to climate change impacts, but compare also what would be the cost of a business as usual scenario that is not going to be resilient neither to economic shocks nor to climate shocks. And I think that's also a very important mindset when we look at the equity impacts in here or in other continents of a scenario of transformation. We need to compare it to a business as usual scenario that is not going to be resilient. For instance, on diversification has a cost. A business as usual scenario where it's all about mass production, massification, and economies of scale is not going to be very resilient. So let's go for accepting the extra cost of diversification, because that's going to be a key element of resilience to economic shocks as well as to climate shocks. And I think that if we are able, thanks to your report, to think about the fact that it's not just the cost of the transition, it's the comparative cost or the comparative resilience between a business as usual scenario and a transformation scenario, I think we are going to have a better structure of the debate on the social dimension, on the equity issue.
Yeah, thank you. Again, we're raising lots of complexity, and I think one of the key points we're acutely conscious of is the importance of not creating the conditions where emissions just get shifted from one part of the globe to the other. In response to different policy approaches that have been taken in one part of the world, one country, one whatever. And would note that I think we've got colleagues from our Trade and Agriculture Directorate here in the room, and obviously this is a critical dimension of the whole picture we need to look at. Dominic, at one stage you were looking anxious to intervene, so add a quick comment and then I'll turn to Andy for a last question.
I appreciate it. I'll be really quick. So to that point, this is where actually in the next stage of the work will be really cool as we get into, so what do we do? You mentioned Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's take Namibia, pretty good place to have green hydrogen. Pretty good place to instill through public and private financing a green industrialization cluster. Pretty good opportunity to cut a deal with the European Union about who would offtake that green steel, car manufacturers or something. Pretty good link then into kind of investing in new generation car manufacturing in the EU, with a CBAM in the middle to make sure that the green steel is green with the right kind of methodologies through Carbon Transparency Project. It's doable, but it requires all of these different directorates from trade and from industry and from green to get our collective heads together and make it practical with the industry side. So 5 or 6 first-of-a-kind, big deal projects like that. And as human nature goes, that's the tipping point that you were talking about earlier. Oh, now we know how to do it. So we can't afford to sort of admire the complexity of the problem. We can't afford to go back to our different directorates and think, well, you know, it's someone else's job. It exemplifies how we can get this thing done. So it's sort of a human condition thing that we've got to kind of get over.
No, thanks for that addition. It's a bit of a nice segue, I think, to the final question for Andy, which is about innovation. And as we've said in the report, it's one of the fundamental needs for a resilient transition. And yet, with the currently really volatile investment climate that we're operating in around the globe, taking risks on early stage technology development is another really complex and difficult thing. It's not easy. How are we going to maintain momentum on systems innovation in the face of these sorts of challenges and volatility?
So, I mean, we're an organisation that has supported something over 3,000 early stage ideas into businesses across Europe and now in Africa and Latin America. And for many years, what we found was they were really struggling to scale. And they were struggling to scale because there were rather nascent markets. There was often misaligned regulatory frameworks. Procurement wasn't there to support it, and so on. So actually what we saw was an example where although there was venture funding in theory, in practice, the problem was actually more on the demand side. We weren't actually creating the demand to pull these things through. It is starting to change now, and it's changing dramatically with some of the incentives in the US. But I do think we need to be thinking here about reflecting on the fact that a lot of venture funding that we have seen, that the model of venture funding has often been equated to particularly a digital revolution where essentially you get almost zero marginal cost to scale this stuff globally. Whereas actually if you're talking about climate tech, you're talking about stuff that goes into the ground, which are highly regulated, buildings, energy, land use, which are highly regulated in the markets we're trying to put them in, which requires more than venture funding to actually test at scale these prototypes. So actually the venture funding model is poorly serves what we need to do here. So from our perspective, it is about both accessing, not just thinking about venture funding, but actually how do we shape the markets which allows us to pull through some of these solutions. And then you're talking not just about venture funding, you're bringing in institutional funding and public funding. So it's a sort of blended mix that you can bring to share some of the risks. So just to give you an example on that, we're leading some of the work in terms of the technical support for the 112 cities in the EU Cities mission. Yeah, so they've all dedicated to try and get to net zero by 2030, okay, 6-7 years away. They estimate, our back of the envelope estimate is just to do the infrastructure, that's just the buildings, some of the transport and so on, that's about 10 billion a city. Yeah. So that's €1 trillion market right there of investment that has to go in the next 7 years. Now, if you think about, if you can bring forward some of the solutions that would help that, and actually enable it and bring it forward, you have a massive opportunity for scaling some of these new solutions coming through into a market that is being shaped by the city authorities, by the national governments and so on. So that mix of not just thinking of technology as being, that's what the innovators is just about the technology. It's also innovation in governance. It's innovation in financing mechanisms. It's innovation in how we essentially deploy and adopt some of these technologies. So for me, it's a much broader piece about how do we make markets? How do we essentially compete in a different way, not head on with the US and the IRA, because that may be a race to the top, but that's not one that many countries are going to win. But there is one opportunity where you could use, for example, the EU's market shaping power to actually pull through and make sure that there is the demand. So not just the push, but also the pull. So there are ways in which we can start to make it happen, but it is getting beyond, if you like, the old, let's use venture capital, try and pick a technology winner. That's not going to work. We actually need a spread bet across multiple things because we don't know which ones are going to work best in which context. And absolutely pick up your point about, often we also need to be thinking, how do we support countries in Africa, in Latin America and elsewhere to deliver the solutions that will actually work for them, rather than think we can produce them and take them over there. So there's a whole piece there around not just thinking about what's happening here in Europe or in America, but actually how do we support the local innovation ecosystems elsewhere.
Okay. I didn't think we were going to get to a point of sort of finding this easy. We clearly don't need just systems thinking. We also need a mindset shift, really, to all sorts of ways in which we do policy making, in which we work together, and so on. So that's a good note, I think, to end the contributions from the panel. I do want to open the floor to any questions. I think we've got roving mics. Yes, I can see them. And I can see already one hand up.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks for the very interesting interventions from the panel. I have a question, which is how can governments better manage and communicate the opportunities and costs that come from the net zero transition? Because we know that the net zero transition will only succeed if there is public support for it. But at the same time, while there will be large opportunities from it, there will also be costs, especially to certain parts of society. So would be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts on that. Thank you.
Yeah, go.
So just on the communication piece, I did a PhD in climate change maybe 30 years ago. And ever since then, the whole way of communicating climate science has been this knowledge deficit model. You know, if only we tell people a bit more about just how bad it is, then magically they're going to fundamentally transform their lives. Yeah, how's that going for us so far? So for us, we think it's much more, you know, for us, it's a sort of imagination deficit. How do we actually communicate in a way that is real for people, that makes it real? I was in this agricultural innovation conference last week with ministers and farmers and so on. And one of the questions was not, you know, do we tell the farmers how bad it's going to be, but rather, what if you're a farmer, what does farming look like on your farm in 20 years' time? What does it smell like? What does it sound like? What's going to actually be your income sources? How do we get the narratives, the storytelling that can actually start to talk very absolutely to people about what their lives might look like, which very much comes to that forecasting piece. You know, it's not pretending that this is what will happen, but it gives them that something that they can cling on to, because our experience in a lot of the doom and gloom that we see is that, you know, you get two responses, one of which is if I'm scared of the future, I'll cling on to what I have. Yeah, so you have exactly the diametrically opposite impact of what you wanted to have when you told everyone how terrible it's going to be in the future. Or the other one is what we call the Titanic view, which is, if we're all doomed, you might as well go first class and have a wonderful time while we're all about it. Yeah? So in other words, if we're going to communicate, let's start talking about from the perspective of the people we're talking to, whether it's a business person, a government, an individual in a city, a town, and so on. But talk to them, what does it look like? What does it feel like to be living in this new environment, in a net zero world? Because that starts to capture where we want to be. That's the storytelling piece that I think has been missing over 20 years and more.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's a really, really important point. Sébastien, you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think your answer is the most important one. I nevertheless wanted to say that for some policymakers, I think it's very important to discuss exactly the framing that is proposed by this report about the vulnerability, so the contrary of resilience, of the current pathway. So not scaring them, but just saying, you might look at the costs and benefits of the transition, but look at the vulnerability of the business as usual pathway. There are lots of risks of economic shocks, of climate shocks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not, and that's, again, I'm talking maybe more about the European context, and it might be very different in another context. But the vulnerability of the food industry, if it stays on the same business model in Europe, is extremely high, while choosing a different pathway might be much more resilient and much better for climate. So that's a kind of a conversation that we have in France with the food and agricultural sector. But I think with the car industry, it's the same type of storyline. What is the economic vulnerability of staying on the same business model? I think that's something that might be also a way to enter them. I'm really very sympathetic with the fact that we should not scare people into the transition. But I think what is very important is to lure them into more resilience with the transition than with the business as usual.
Can I just go back to that? Because I agree. And I think that whole notion of asking an industry about value at risk is a really good one. And I do think that the conversations we have had about that have changed markedly over the last 5 to 7 years because of the pandemic, because of the Ukraine-Russia situation and so on. In other words, what was unthinkable 5 years ago has now become thinkable. And so actually going in and talking about that value at risk, carrying on as per normal is not going to be a good option. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that on the, it's going to be really terrible. Okay, what's the time? If I was just to add one thing, it's the joining the dots bit. So systems thinking, but we did this at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development because it's quite a complicated landscape, right? Everything, everywhere, all at once, to coin a phrase. And so how do you get it kind of simple to understand? So by 2050, 9 billion people living well within planetary boundaries. That's it. That's where we landed. And it encapsulates all of the different aspects. And then within that, so go make your business work. And that's been really helpful because it doesn't say climate versus nature versus tackling inequality. But it does say that, you know, we have a system change at work. If I was on the policy side, I might contend I would take that and I would get rid of this rather wonderful idea, but rather terrible phrase, donut economics. And I would take a paradigm of how do I maximize welfare within the constraints of the above and the below. And I would throw a bunch of policy at that, because that's the same thing, but from an economic welfare maximization context. But what I just said in kind of language other people understand. And I don't see anybody really doing that. I don't see anybody kind of maximizing welfare against different constraints, which is good old-fashioned microeconomics, in my humble opinion, and flip that over to the business side and let's see what we got. I'd be game.
Great. We've got time for probably one more question. Yes, in front here.
So thank you so much for all your interventions. I just wanted to ask, the report highlights the urgency of addressing climate system tipping points, so one of the very bad things you were talking about. And so in your view, how can these risks be integrated into policymaking today? And are you already seeing examples of this happening, typically in foresighting climate system tipping points being taken into account? Thank you.
I think probably everyone wants to have a quick say on that. Sébastien, maybe not so sure, but Andy, you want to start, and then Dominic. Oh, Dominic, okay.
So I love this concept, and this actually, it's good news that it's arrived into the policymaking context, but you know, we were at it in the run-up to the Paris agenda on climate change. So there was really deep concern after Copenhagen around 2012, 2013 that Paris wouldn't work. What would make it work? More confidence for governments that a kind of more ambitious deal could be made. How do you get more confidence to governments? Among other things, civil society and particularly kind of investors and business leaders would say, go for a more ambitious deal. Could you get every kind of CEO and investor to that? No. Could you find a tipping point in terms of every key sector so that between 12 and 20% of market cap of that sector had a couple of representatives saying, go for it? Yes. And that's exactly the Lima Paris Action Agenda that was created and that helped all of our friends in IDDRI and others who were leading the charge on the Paris Climate Agenda to get that over the line. That was a tipping point in action, which was thought out and delivered 2013, 2014, 2015. That spurred the champions, and many of us know Nigel Topping very well, and that methodology for tipping points in the champions agenda. And I could go on, but it's an absolutely crucial device, particularly in that ability to give confidence to policymakers to go for it.
Yep, absolutely. So you get somebody starting down the slide, and you have that critical mass in a way the rest have to go. Andy.
Yeah, just to build on what Dominic said, one of the things that we have been doing with country governments on different economic sectors, so in Ireland with the agri-food sector, on circular economy, on a number of sectors with the Slovenian government and so on, has been kind of trying to get them to live that notion of how do you get that exponential change happening, and in systems change thinking you talk about exponential effects, you talk about emergence that comes from actually learning across and getting different relationships going, which allows very rapid learning. In practical terms, that means an awful lot of fairly hard meetings, bringing together people with very different perspectives to get to the point where you can start to pull out both what those, we call it reconnaissance, what those real opportunities are that exist, and people just start to connect. And when they start to connect, it's not then through a central point, it's actually you start to get different little coalitions of interest following and following, and then you end up exactly in that point where 15-20% of a group suddenly go for it, and everyone's wanting to be on the inside, and they all start chasing, and you start moving very, very quickly. So we are seeing it in practice. Trying to design it in is actually quite hard, as you can imagine, but we are starting to see some good examples from different organizations of how you can design in that type of approach, which allows you to start to bring in radical collaborators, that brings in different perspectives, but also has that clarity of where are we trying to get to. And so you know, then you can start to really bring in exciting ideas and it starts to accelerate. So.
And I was just trying, I mean, I've been in charge of foresight at the Ministry for the Environment in France 20 years ago. And I don't believe that community of strategic foresight has often been able to really impact political decision-making at the highest scale. So I'm a little bit, I'm in favor of that taking more space, but I see that as complicated. What we see, just a very short, I think the interesting example of France is this General Secretariat for Ecological Planning. This is not strategic foresight. This is not about planning the uncertainty. It's really about looking at trying to apply a planetary boundaries approach to long-term planning in different sectors. So it's not about uncertainty, it's about what's already certain. That if we want to be net zero, there are things that are certain. But I think that's looking to the future, trying to find the envelope of what is possible and what is impossible is actually quite kind of an interesting experiment. The only concern that I have is to what extent they are actually able to win over political arbitrage with regard to sectoral ministries. Although they are at the scale with the Prime Minister, I'm quite positive that there are sectoral ministries, agriculture, industry, that in the end are able to downturn their suggestions in terms of what would be the good sectoral pathway or the target into something that is less anticipatory. So I'm not sure that's exactly an answer to you, but that's something to follow and to monitor.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you, everyone. We have run out of time. I'm 1 minute over, so my concluding remarks are going to be incredibly brief. First of all, I think that's been an excellent panel discussion. It has really sort of outlined the complexity and breadth that not just the whole of organization, but the whole of economy, whole of the globe approach we are going to need to take to this, to deal with this triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity, and pollution. But at the same time, I think we've finished on a note that is a nice sort of lead in to the next phase, where I think it is going to be really exciting to be looking at some of the positive and practical ways we can get the exponential change and transformation that we need. So I want to extend heartfelt thanks, and I'm clearly can't name everybody, but to all the Andrew and the whole team who worked to pull this synthesis report together, to all the many people across so many directorates within the OECD and the committees that contributed to it, and finish by thanking you, my three remaining panelists, and Natacha in her absence, for coming along and really giving us some great food for thought today. So please join me in thanking everybody for